Welcome, everybody, to this Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy webinar on COP26 outcomes, reviews, and analysis. I'm David Morrow, the Director of Research here at the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy, and I'm very pleased to welcome an outstanding panel here today to talk about what happened at COP26, what it means generally, and what it means for carbon removal in particular. We are going to begin with some remarks from each of our panelists about what they think are some of the most important takeaways from COP26. We'll then have some discussion between the panelists, and then we will take questions from audience members. To submit your questions, which you can do at any time during the webinar, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, and we will moderate those questions later in the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy website and to our YouTube channel. So let's get started. Our first panelist is Hunter Cuttings, a senior advisor at Climate Nexus. Hunter, can I invite you to tell us about 1 to 3 top takeaways from COP26?
Sure. So I got to watch this particular COP from afar, which was an interesting perspective. For me, this COP was a bit like the movie Groundhog Day. In other words, we've seen this story before, yeah? As we all saw, there was significant progress, but we still ended up far away from the trajectory we need to be on in order to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And each year of delay now adds dramatically to the challenge, right? And whether the 1.5 degree pathway is still within reach is a question upon which reasonable minds can and are disagreeing. So for me, one of the takeaways from this COP is that we are going to need access to every single tool in the toolbox, including CDR. The other takeaway from this COP and the dynamics here in the United States is that the delay in reducing emissions reductions is essentially political. It's not a scientific mystery. It's not a major economic challenge. It's essentially a political challenge. And in looking at the larger political landscape, some of the rhetoric that promotes CDR is part of that political problem. So how we develop access to CDR in the mitigation toolbox while contending with the unwarranted rhetoric promoting CDR from some quarters becomes a key communications question at this point. I would also flag another outcome. Looking at the NDCs, the long-term strategies, and the Article 6 agreement, it's clear that CDR has left the train station. It's off and running and going. And looking across nations, particularly here in the United States, it's clear that there's significant institutional momentum now behind CDR. So for me, another takeaway from this COP is that given CDR has left the train station, ensuring that CDR is done responsibly, particularly in regard to climate justice, is now a key task. And speaking of climate justice, I would note that this COP saw greater discussion about the role of CDR in addressing the legacy emissions of developed countries, a key element when considering equity. Altogether, I think the consideration of equity and climate justice will be an increasing part of the CDR conversation, and I'll end it there.
Thanks, Hunter. Let's turn next to János Pastor, Executive Director of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative and former UN Assistant Secretary General for Climate Change. János?
Thank you, David, and thank you for inviting me. So I've been asked to look at COP26 outcomes, in particular, how it has an impact on the UNFCC process and other climate processes. So I'll do that. So these two bits, and under each, I will look at 2 issues. So first, there is some good news. I think I share some of the good news. There is a process, things are happening, things are moving. One can implement these things. We'll have more frequent updates for the national climate plans. We had excellent participation of non-state actors. And there has been a really high level of discussion in society about climate change. And all this is a good thing. There is also some not so good news. Particularly in the UNFCC process, that there were huge expectations have been put on the next COP in Egypt. All the things that Glasgow couldn't, now there's expectation that Sharm el-Sheikh will do that. And We also have to figure out how to make these commitments, pledges made by non-state actors accountable, because they're not at the moment. And I think, Hunter, you mentioned about climate justice. The UNFCCC process is not doing very well on that, and that really needs to be addressed. And some people are even saying that the whole UNFCCC process is failing. So how do you deal with that, even if it's a perception, even if it's not necessarily true? So that's the UNFCCC part. Very quickly on the climate politics in general, I think there are lots of issues about how to convert the mid-century pledges, mid-century net zero pledges to something concrete. And I believe this cannot happen only in the UNFCCC. It needs to be looked at broader. Yes, it's political, Hunter, I agree. It needs the G2s, the G7s, the G20s, and it needs the poor, vulnerable countries to pull these guys along as well. But this cannot happen simply in the UNFCCC. It needs to be in lots of different places. It also needs massive technological innovation to ensure that everybody is, that the technology will be available as well. And then the last point, how to manage the risk of overshoot, because the overshoot is coming. Let's be clear. Under the best of scenarios, we're going to be heading towards something like 1.8 degrees, and that's the best. So how will the world get ready to deal with overshoot? There are limits to adaptation. We don't know what exactly it is, but there is a limit. We don't want to be in the Johan Rockström Hauthauser scenario of uncharted territory. So how do we deal with this? And just one quick thing, Hunter, you mentioned about the need for CDR is clear, yes, but even the IPCC said very clearly that it may not be enough, even massive emission reductions and a massive CDR. So we may need something else. And this is where potentially solar radiation modification comes in. And that's something we need to discuss. We need to engage conversation of how we can at least even talk about it. So I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, János. I'll turn next to Jason Funk, who is principal and founder of the Land Use and Climate Knowledge Initiative, as well as a fellow here at the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy. Jason?
Thanks, David. And thanks, this is a great panel to be part of. So I'm really humbled to be here. I want to talk a little bit about the outcomes as they relate to what we might call biological CDR or natural carbon capture. I'll probably use natural carbon capture, but I think of all those terms interchangeably. I would say this COP leaves those possibilities probably on stronger footing than they've ever been before. There were some high-level political signals and developments. And then there was also the resolution of a few mechanisms that make it more possible for countries to cooperate on support for these activities. So I'll touch on a few of those. There was a high-level Glasgow Forest Declaration, which was sort of just a political declaration. Countries agreed to do good things together, support each other. There's a reference to a sustainable land use transition, 6 points that they agreed to share efforts. So, I think that's a helpful signal. It doesn't, we've seen these kinds of declarations before. They don't always mean that they translate into action. So I'm going to withhold judgment a little bit to see where that leads, but it is certainly better than not having it. A second aspect was a draft decision of this group called the Cornevia Joint Work on Agriculture. So this is the place where the conversation is happening around agriculture, which can include CDR in that system. There's been a roadmap that's been a series of workshops and discussions and negotiations happening for several years. That roadmap was completed, and so there was kind of a question mark before this COP, like what's going to happen next? Is this going to go somewhere? Are we done? Is agriculture part of the picture or not? And so the decision that came out of Glasgow says, we're going to think about all the stuff we've talked about, and we intend to have a COP level decision at the next meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, where we may, in fact, the intent is to have a stronger mandate for this work program to continue. So the discussion's not over. Again, it's sort of a political signal that there's not, new floodgates opening toward agricultural CDR, but the conversation continues and it seems like the door is still open. And that has been a place where a lot of the practices that can accomplish CDR have been discussed for the agriculture sector. So those are kind of two signals that I thought were interesting. I think the big action was around the Article 6 issues, which are a series of mechanisms by which countries can work together cooperatively. And that includes the possibility of emissions trading across countries. It includes support for projects on the ground that can accomplish, natural carbon capture. And those things were resolved. Those have been sort of hanging out there for a couple of years without a decision, without clarity about how those mechanisms were going to work. So I think that resolution helps to bring some clarity and certainty that will allow action to proceed through that cooperative way. That has implications for past mechanisms like RED+, which is the mechanism around reducing emissions from deforestation and increasing sequestration in forests. It can also have some implications for other types of activities. And of course, as Hunter said, all of this now is a possibility, but it requires us to take these actions in a responsible way. So I think that's what everyone's going to be looking at next. We have the possibility for countries to work together on the land sector to achieve CDR, and that's a good thing, but it can also go wrong in some circumstances. So we need to keep an eye on that. So I think we'll probably delve more into the Article 6 decisions as we go, but that's my sort of high level take.
Thanks, Jason. We turn next to Angela Anderson, Director of Industrial Innovation and Carbon Removal at the World Resources Institute.
Thank you, David. It's great to be with you all. And I've been asked today to talk about industrial emissions and the implications for reducing those emissions from the COP. Why are we talking about industrial emissions? Well, in a webinar about CDR, the reason is that, like as Hunter talked about, how essential CDR is going to be to removing legacy emissions, it's also going to be used, as the U.S. has pointed out in its long-term strategy, to offset not my favorite word, but to offset residual emissions. And most of those residual emissions are likely to come from the industrial sector. And the reason for that is they account for 40% of all greenhouse gases around the world. And in the US, 23% of 23% of emissions, and then more when you add up to 30 when you add in their electricity use. And while we've rightly been focused on replacing coal and gas-fired power with renewables and replacing gas cars and trucks with electric ones, we've done less on the industrial side. Between 2005 and 2019, the total US greenhouse gas emissions declined by 12%. Not nearly enough, but on the right track. But industrial emissions fell by less than 1%. So how did the COP affect industrial emissions? I think there were several key developments that are going to help us draw more attention to the sector and bring more action to the sector. First is just the number of countries that committed to net zero targets, including the United States, China, and India. And all as countries devise long-term strategies, like I just mentioned, the U.S. has, it's going to include they're going to have to include the industrial sector. Similarly, the agreement to try to limit global warming to 1.5 means that global CO2 emissions have to be cut by 45% by 2030. And while the largest of those emissions is still going to come from the power sector, it's going to be very difficult to reach that target without contributions from the industrial sector as well. Outside the formal negotiations, in Glasgow, there were some important initiatives announced that are aimed at kickstarting the decarbonization in the industrial sector. The US-led First Movers Coalition featured 25 founding member companies that pledged to support innovations needed to meet net zero targets. They agreed to purchase early supplies of net zero emission steel, cement, aluminum, and chemicals. And this is important because we have steel companies and cement companies who have made commitments to produce net zero products, but they don't have many commitments from their suppliers that they'll buy them. The climate group has announced buyers clubs that are committed to purchasing those zero carbon steel and concrete once they're produced. So those two things will help in the private sector. In addition, the Clean Energy Ministerial, its industrial decarbonization initiative announced some global green procurement principles that'll add to the commitment to buy these products. And I should also mention that not at the COP, but during the COP, an initiative that WRI and the Great Plains Institute has facilitated issued a blueprint for action in the industrial sector. The I3 blueprint, some of the I3 blueprints recommendations were signed in the IIJA, and I think it's just important for us to all recognize that, to give Glasgow a fighting chance, bills like that and the Build Back Better Act that are still hangs in the balance are really essential to, fulfilling the promise of Glasgow. So those are the key inside and outside initiatives on industrial decarbonization, and I'm happy to explore more those connections to carbon removal in our discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Angela. And for our final set of introductory remarks on key takeaways from COP26, I'll turn to Arturo Garcia Costas, Program Officer for Local, National, and International Environment at one of our funders, the New York Community Trust. Arturo?
Thanks, David. Apologize for being a little bit delayed. Had a chat with my president about something not related to COP26. So I'll be really quick about my impressions of this COP. I'll begin by saying that the last one I went to was in 2004, COP10 in Buenos Aires. At the time, I was running a program for UNDP with the Global Environment Facility Unit that focused on the intersection between the Rio Conventions. So it was a very different experience for me this time around. Coming in from the funding community, it was different. Also, I did not have Blue Zone access. So that was also an interesting way to experience the COP this time around. But not having Blue Zone access, I left the COP with a couple of big impressions. One is that there's a lot of focus on the negotiations, what's happening inside the negotiations within the media. But my impression of what's happened with the COPs is they've become global town halls about climate, about this sort of existential challenge that's facing our civilization, and that we need to understand what it means to have that kind of global town hall dynamic. And governments and delegations should be more intentional about playing into that or connecting into that global town hall dynamic rather than focusing on the, I'm sorry to say, relatively constipated international negotiation process. So that's one takeaway. The other one is around net zero. I was experiencing, because I was marching with folks in the systems change, not climate change, contingent at the 150,000 person march on Saturday. So I had some interesting conversations with them about net zero. There's a lot of, for example, Friends of the Earth delegations there and others. There is very, very strong skepticism about net zero, that it's going to be very, very easy to game that kind of system. So without very, very transparent or intentional mechanisms to forestall that kind of gaming, I think that you're going to see continued opposition and critiques about that pathway, that central organizing principle that I think is starting to be embraced by most delegations and many other actors in the global system. And I'm with them because I think the devil's pretty much in the details when it comes to net zero. One of the things that I'm really enjoying about the work of the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy is looking at, with a dispassionate eye, what some of the approaches means and what the scenarios are, right? And I am of the opinion that if we don't design a system where we're trying to do at least 2-to-1, drawing down twice as much carbon dioxide as being emitted over the next 10, 15 years, then I don't think we're going to make it. That just is not going to work in terms of stabilizing the global climate system. And which leads me to my final point here is that I was in the room several times as a funder with youth leaders, including a lovely young woman whose name escapes me from the Sudan. She is the sort of the head of the Secretary General's Youth Assembly, and she spoke with us about the COP, and it's understandable they have skepticism about 2040 targets and 2045 targets and 2050 targets because they consider them to be magical thinking that really are used to forestall tough choices now and try to kick the can down the road quite often. So one of my takeaways from that conversation that ensued with a number of those youth leaders is that these sorts of targets, net zero targets particularly, that don't come with very strong annual or biannual targets and milestones so that you can have some degree of accountability in the system. This goes back to the issue of like, what kind of system are we going to put in place to govern net zero efforts? Without those kind of strong targets and milestones, then it really is just greenwashing, which is what is undermining, frankly, the faith in this entire process, this constipated process, which we've been dealing with for about 2 generations now. So those are my sort of high-level comments about the takeaways from this COP.
Thanks, Arturo. That was a really rich set of introductory comments from all of our panelists. Before we turn to Q&A from the audience, I would like to invite our panelists to comment on or ask questions of the things that the others have said, and or to reflect maybe more broadly on what COP26 means for our particular topic of interest, which is carbon removal. In the meantime, let me remind the other attendees here that if you do have questions, please submit them through the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we will turn to those audience questions in a few moments. Is there anyone among the panelists who would like to get started? Janos, please.
Yeah, so I have a comment and I have a question. So my question is actually to Hunter, because at some point you said that the delay is not because of science, it's because of the politics. And while I agree, I don't fully agree in the sense that, yes, politics is important, but politics is driven by each one of us. And I see in lots of places people accept climate change, accept anthropogenic climate change, human-induced climate change, but don't put a windmill in my backyard. So the social economic factor is also important, and I was going to ask you to comment on that. While you're thinking, if I may, David, just my quick comment on CDR. I think at COP26, there's a lot more discussion in the side events for sure, a lot more. One colleague I spoke, he said 10 times as much as in the previous COP, so that's moving forward. But in terms of the negotiations, the formal, the inside part, there is precious too little on this topic, and I think it's time for government representatives, parties to the treaty, to start really seriously talk about that.
Well, it sounds like I should take you up on your invitation there, Janos. Yes, I was using politics in the most broadest terms, certainly to include the social aspect of politics, from the personal all the way up to the institutional. So I think that's a good call out. Thank you. And also, yeah, maybe I was speaking a little too loosely when I meant that I don't see any economic barriers. We all know that the world's going to be better off economically going down the clean energy path, regardless of whether or not, regardless of the climate change impacts, right? That said, there are wrinkles along the way. So just to dive down for a little color here in the United States, you know, our brothers and sisters in the labor unions are really concerned that they're going to lose well-paying, good union jobs, right? Because the clean energy sector isn't well unionized. Also, it's just different skill sets, different jobs. And so the dislocation there is going to be huge, right? So there is going to be economic dislocation. You know, we constantly talk about this phrase, like what's really going to happen is whether we're going to have an orderly transition or a disorderly transition at the end of the day, right? And so, yes, there's definitely a political economic side to this. But that said, I do think that we have to acknowledge that we have to apply a political lens to this problem. Otherwise, we're going to misunderstand the problem as a scientific problem or fundamentally an economic problem. And maybe it was fundamentally an economic problem 15 years ago or 20 years ago, but I don't think it's fundamentally an economic problem now. I think it's fundamentally political, but it does have economic dimensions. So anyways, I hope that nuance responds to your really good call outs here.
Any other interventions, comments, questions among the panelists?
Well, I'd like to hear more about the forestry. It really felt like that was with the Article 6 stuff in particular. And I think we have a question in the chat actually about hearing more about Article 6 and forestry. So Jason, if you wouldn't mind unpacking more of that, I think that would be helpful.
And Jason, before you start that, you might begin with a very general reminder of what Article 6 is.
Sure, yeah. Article 6 is a component of the Paris Agreement that was established in 2015, and it allows for countries to cooperate on achieving their mitigation targets. So there are aspects of it like the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, that are solely the commitment of one party. And this Article 6 was intended to develop a series of mechanisms by which they could cooperate. And that was super important for developing countries because often they don't have the resources to mobilize their mitigation potential. And so if they can get external support, then that means the whole globe can benefit if they're able to mobilize those activities. That's a bit of a fraught conversation because, you know, from one perspective, you could say we're shifting the burden of mitigation onto developing countries. There's certainly that argument out there. On the other hand, you can say if there's financial support that's coming to help those activities and they're designed in a way that contributes to their economic development, then that can be a positive thing for those developing countries. So there are different views on whether or not these mechanisms are good or not, and then they come in 3 different flavors. So one aspect of it was country to country exchange, which looks a lot like emissions trading. And that's a system that's already in place in the EU. So it's sort of been road tested, but this would allow that possibility to happen globally with all countries. The second aspect of it is related to project level activities. This was something that was carried over from the previous agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, that had a mechanism called the Clean Development Mechanism that allowed developed countries to provide financial support for project level activities in developing countries. So that got a bit of a refresh, and a lot of the same approaches stayed in place. There were some changes to that mechanism, including its name. It's now the Sustainable Development Mechanism, I think. But a lot of it was kind of just new wine and old skins, or however that, that idiom goes. And then the third approach was about non-market approaches. And that's something that was present in the Paris Agreement. It's been hanging around. I myself don't quite understand how it's going to be operationalized, but they created a work program for these non-market approaches, and those will kick off in 2022 and begin to develop tools to implement those non-market approaches, whatever it might end up being. So it's not just about markets, but it includes these other possibilities as well. So that meant that there were 3 related decisions all about these 3 flavors of Article 6. The one that it allows for country-to-country support is sort of the cleanest and most straightforward. It was resolved, even though there was drama right up until the very end and sort of new things being thrown in, 24 hours before the close of the COP. In the end, that decision seems like something that was just, they chose kind of the simplest approach. Like they just resolved things. That's somewhat frustrating to me because it's kind of like, couldn't we have done this in 2017? Like, why did we have to spend all this time hashing these things out, only to arrive at this relatively simple, conclusion? But better to have it finished than, to still be uncertain.
Hence the notion of a constipated process. You could have passed that.
Maybe not the word I would use, but
really could have passed that.
it may apply here. Yeah. It's the pace of diplomacy is not the normal everyday pace that we're used to. The second flavor, the project-based approaches, it's clear that there's a pathway for those things to continue, but they're going to be less attractive over time. And I think that was intentional. There's a desire among all the parties to shift things toward that national level. And those project level approaches have been places where concerns have arisen about double counting and is this really legit? Is this hot air? It turns out not many of those concerns apply to the land sector, even though it sometimes gets that reputation. But it's worth cleaning those things up no matter what sector they apply to. And I think this is called Article 6.4, this track. There's sort of a narrowing pathway and it becomes less attractive over time to do things at the project level, though still possible. It's sort of like vaccination, right? Like the best approach is to just go ahead and get vaccinated, but it's still possible to be unvaccinated and go down that path as well. It's just going to be less attractive over time. So those things are kind of key. If you'll indulge me, I have one figure I can show you for kind of why this is important for developing countries, why I think this is significant. So I'll try to share my screen here and show you this one figure. If you can see that, this is from a 2020 paper, and it shows this chart of the natural climate solutions or natural mitigation potential within a host of developing countries compared to their own domestic emissions. And you can see there's about 24 countries that have the potential to generate surplus mitigation from their land sector. That means they could reach net zero and go beyond. And some of them are ones we would suspect, like Costa Rica. They've been doing a great job managing their land sector for decades. That means that now, if they can generate that surplus, if they can hit net zero and go beyond, these Article 6 mechanisms give them the potential to really significantly financially benefit from that and reinvest that in sustainable development. The second part of the chart shows a comparison of the value of that NCS potential to their current GDP. And in some cases, they could increase their GDP by 10 or 20 or 30%. That's huge. I mean, imagine a new industry in these countries that's boosting their GDP by that amount. That's quite significant. So I think these possibilities and the opportunities are potentially really substantial for a lot of poor developing countries who have a lot of land sector mitigation potential. And we need to do that carefully. We need to do that in a just way. But I think the benefits, if we can do that successfully, could be dramatic. So that's why I'm kind of optimistic about the possibilities that are opened up by the resolution of these Article 6 decisions. I'll stop sharing.
All right, thanks, Jason. Arturo?
thanks for that. I just want to shift gears a little bit because I'm kind of interested in another area that was a focus, and there actually had some good news, had to do with finance, right? Climate finance, and most of it focused on sort of the relationship of finance to the fossil fuel industry. But I had a couple of questions I left the COP with on this front. One is how, keeping in mind the chart that Jason just shared that signals some potential for a successful emissions trading system coming into being. But I'm interested how debt, how the current sort of highly indebted countries, and how debt and how the World Trade Organization and the existing trade system that we have on the planet, how those things interact with what we're discussing right now in net zero, because that I haven't heard as much of a discussion of. And I am really at a point where we have to start breaking down these silos that are inhibiting our ability to address climate change. And what's happened with finance, I think, is a hopeful sign of the breaking down of a big silo. But I don't have a lot of hope that we're going to be able to have a successful emissions trading system without taking a look at those two other structural things that are keeping countries from developing sustainably.
Janos, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I don't think I can answer the question, but I'd like to take it actually a step further. I agree with you, Arturo, but if this is to succeed anything close to 1.5 degrees, then there will have to be very substantial transfer of resources, real transfer of resources, not $100 billion, much higher levels of transfer of resources to the developing countries. Let's face it, that a lot of those commitments, the pledges that they have made, are conditional upon receiving resources to be able to do those emission reductions. So if those resources don't happen, then those emission reductions will not happen, and will be much further away from the 1.5, the 1.8, and the 2.5 degrees than we would like to be. Now, that's where I think that bigger picture suddenly comes up, that this is not just about carbon. This is not just about little things that will count in an MRBC, in a system of accounting. It is about how the interrelated global world is moving forward in development, and how will one part of the world help the other part, not because they're nice. It's about enlightened self-interest, and that question is not being discussed anywhere, really. Let's be honest about it. And there's real resources that will be needed, much higher than people are talking about. So this is very difficult, and I think it's high time that leaders started seriously talking about this, so that we can actually see how the world might actually move in that direction.
And I'll add one other thing to that. Thank you so much, Janos. I've got these numbers at the top of my head, so they're a little bit dated, but in 2016, what was called climate finance, I think it was 93% of what was called climate finance took place in two countries, China and the United States, and most of that was wind. And it just speaks to the notion, in terms of the transfer of resources, that we also have to figure out how to unlock private capital flows and change that dynamic dramatically, so that 80% of private financial investments from the developed world are going into the developing world. And if we don't figure out how to do that, then I'm not sure we can succeed.
All right, I hate to cut this conversation short, but I also know that we have a flood of questions coming in from audience members. So I might turn to some of those. And for things that we don't get to talk about in the next 20 minutes, we will offer the panelists a chance to respond in writing to comments that they think they can usefully respond to in a short written piece, and we'll post that when we post this recording on our website. Right? So now my challenge is choosing from all of these fantastic questions here. But I think I will start with a question directed at Angela, because it seems sort of different than some of the other things we've just been talking about. And the question is about whether zero carbon steel and cement are currently technologically feasible, where they are along the spectrum from works in theory to shovel ready, is the way that the questioner puts it. And of course, this is relevant to carbon removal, because the more you abate in industrial emissions, the less you have to clean up later.
So it varies. As we say with so many things, there's not one way to create concrete, and cement is an ingredient in concrete. But yes, there are some means to create a negative or a zero emissions cement right now. The obstacles to doing that are formidable. That, you know, even though it technically can be done, getting folks to actually do it and adopt that kind of cement both speaks to the industry, the cement industry, but also to their customers, and whether their customers will accept zero carbon cement. Do they trust that it is as strong as the other types of cement? So it's a little deceiving. There are many different ways that different industries have to approach decarbonization in terms of the solutions they employ, and then their supply chain has to buy into it too. Similarly on steel, there are some types of steel, essentially the newer facilities that are easier, that don't require high heat blast furnaces, for example, that it's a little easier for those to decarbonize. But when you're talking about different types of steel, particularly the kind that tend to be those big, large rolls that go into vehicle production, those are harder. Because they require, you know, significantly high heat, and carbon capture and sequestration isn't can tackle parts of the operations, but not all of it. Not an engineer, but that's what I understand from the folks we talk to in terms of the state of decarbonization. But the good news is there's so many possibilities and lots of innovative thinking going on, and now some of the new programs that are coming out of the bill, and I think out of these announcements in COP, can really foster more education, more financial investment to make this happen. And we're going to be doing some work to really foster some greater understanding along the supply chains.
Great, thanks, Angela. We've got again, a quite different question here. That I'll try to combine with a few others. The overarching question is, was there any discussion at COP about the social license for CDR and how this varies across different types of carbon removal? And I'll combine that with some other questions by pointing out some specific approaches to carbon removal that audience members have asked questions about. People are interested in agricultural plant biology approaches to carbon removal, some questions about biochar, a number of questions about ocean-based approaches to carbon removal. So what discussion was there about social license for carbon removal? And if you have anything in particular on agricultural carbon removal, ocean-based carbon removal, or biochar, those would be especially welcome. And that is to anyone who wants to answer that. Arturo?
Yeah, I can go ahead. I think I would take a step up from that, because it's like there's in each of those there's like a bunch of different things that have to be unpacked.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing, I'm approaching this as someone who has worked in government quite often and does a lot of grant making, try to influence government decision making. And I really need to think that I think we have to find some mechanism for the kind of opposite of full cost accounting. We use full cost accounting to try to address externalities, environmental externalities, in different ways of arriving at the price of things or the cost of things. when it comes to resource allocation and budgeting by government agencies, we need to have some sort of full benefit accounting so that all the benefits from a particular intervention are figured into the decision-making process. And that is not happening. And why I use this question to bring this up is that for each of those, if you took a look at it from a full benefit accounting perspective, you would come up with different choices, different trade-offs, or one of those things might appeal more than another to a particular country or agency. So that's my response to that, but it is high level.
Anyone else want to take a crack at that question?
I'm kind of curious what you think, David.
I'm going to dodge that response by
That's jujitsu, Angela.
that question.
You're a moderator to answer.
By pointing out that it's a question about whether there was discussion about this at COP.
Yeah.
Right, which sitting here in DC, I did not see it, but wouldn't necessarily know. But I do want to echo Arturo's point that it varies a lot from different approaches, even drilling down below the categories that we just mentioned. This is something that we here at the Institute think is really important. And looking at all those benefits and costs in various ways, like not just sort of full benefit accounting or benefit cost analysis, but multi-criteria decision analysis or ways to tackle these really thorny, complicated questions where you have pros and cons that are hard to compare with one another.
Yeah, I was teasing a little bit, but I'll jump in. And I think Janos's mic is off, so maybe he has something smarter to say. I think that responsible scaling of CDR is a term I've heard in different contexts lately, and I think it's a good way towards what we need to be thinking about, and that is really making sure that we do with CDR the kinds of things we've never done with other development, and that is early engagement at the community level, a lot of scenario planning about and transparency around expected impacts of the facilities or the approaches, as well as potential unintended consequences, and that we really consider those as part of sort of the decision-making tree. I would recommend to the group, I think Carbon 180 did a really nice job with their Remove Forward report that just came out in August that kind of talks about how do we really tackle some of the equity and justice questions around these technologies and these approaches. And I think there's a lot to unpack there. I don't know if it goes completely to social license, but for me, it's just, good practice we need to adopt as we move into this area.
Janos and then Hunter.
Just a very quick one on this. So this was my second COP out of 26 that I did not participate in, so I couldn't tell. But from what I've spoken with colleagues, there was a lot of discussion in the side events on CDR, including some aspects that eventually will result in social license type discussions. But what I can also say is that based on the conversations myself and my colleagues have been having with government representatives, that there is an absolute lack of discussion in pretty much all countries about how to engage society on issues related to carbon dioxide removal, and therefore there is basically a lack of discussion of social license in most places, and that means also that there is no discussion yet in the formal part of the COP with the negotiators. So there is a big gap there that needs to be met somehow, and we haven't yet met that in COP26 in Glasgow.
Hunter?
I mean, I would echo everything that's been said and add on. I think they're coming out of COP, the decisions that were made at COP do provide momentum CDR. There's a growing social license to CDR, and this COP helped push that along. Like it or not, that's just what happened. And so that's why at the beginning I called for us to look at, I think the question increasingly becomes then, how is it done responsibly? Because that train has left the station. As Angela pointed out, there's real questions about responsible deployment of CDR. And then there's a flip side to it that I think is also of real importance to the climate justice community. What kind of projects can use CDR? So if you're operating that refinery in Richmond, the Chevron refinery, can you just operate that refinery forever by buying CDR offsets? And then the local community has to suffer from the other pollutants that come out of that refinery? I mean, so this is a key question. And also one thing I'm very curious about is, I suspect that with this Article 6, that we're gonna see a land rush, quite frankly, in developing countries for people who want access to those CDR offsets. And so the question becomes like, well, who should be allowed to get those offsets? Because there's only a limited number of them, right? Like there's not an infinite amount of land out there that we can use for these kind of negative emissions. And I think the airline industry is going to gobble up a whole bunch of them real quick. Is that a good result of, is it just first come, first serve? And this speaks to the question that many, I think, rightly raise, like, is CDR being used in place of emissions reductions that should be done? So I think these are the questions that really rise quickly to the top of the agenda in the wake of this COP.
That's a nice segue to a couple other questions that the audience has been asking. The first is originally directed to Arturo here. I think in light of the comment you made about your experience in Glasgow, it says a lot of us are keeping a keen eye on the evolving attitude of NGOs towards CDR. Does opposition to net zero equate to opposition to CDR among the NGOs that you've spoken with?
David knows and others know that I have been sort of engaged in this for a better part of the year because I have been concerned that in the United States, at least, a lot of environmental justice groups and organizations have been putting out reports, false solutions reports, many of them focusing on net zero and some of the problems with potentially gaming net zero systems. But it sometimes also conflates with CDR and healthy soils and reforestation and those sorts of things. And so I've been concerned that stuff is being conflated too much. So I think it's important to understand not to conflate things, not to lump things together. The real situation, as far as I can tell from my conversations, that it's more nuanced. That right now, many of those organizations rightly look with a jaundiced eye at market-based mechanisms because they've been promised things over and over again that would emerge from market-based mechanisms that have not come to pass. So any system that is based in market-based mechanisms that don't have a sufficient, sorry, someone's calling me, that don't have sufficient safeguards and accountability, transparency, et cetera, that don't channel things, or as Hunter's suggesting, actually say this can't be used, you can't do CDR, you can't do carbon capture and sequestration in these circumstances because of all these other risks and impacts that doing so will have. Without those sorts of safeguards in place, I think you're going to see continuing opposition from climate justice interests, organizations and movements and stakeholders across the world to net zero and CDR. So I think the challenge is to disaggregate and to really focus on, this is what we're talking about here. We're not saying that this should be used as a license, speaking of licenses, to continue the dirty fossil fuel generation that's hurting people, et cetera.
Thanks. And there's another question that zooms out from that a little bit, but I see Jason wants to jump in there beforehand, I think.
Just to circle back on this, I think there were some important developments about accountability and also the how, and maybe that's part of the context here, is that this COP signals a transition since 2015, we've sort of been in this conversation about the what. Countries, tell us what you want to do. Tell us, what things you're going to do to address this challenge. They committed to tell us what they're going to do and inscribe those in their NDCs. Now the Paris Agreement is in effect. We've been waiting for it to sort of take hold. This COP, it's clearly the case that it's happening. And so now the question becomes not what, but how. How are you going to do this? How are you going to do this in a just way? How are you going to do this with appropriate safeguards? So on the natural carbon capture aspect of things, there's been some really great work, in particular by Natalie Seddon's lab at Oxford, defining this concept of nature-based solutions, which includes climate solutions, and specifying the kinds of safeguards that need to be in place around any of those solutions so that they can be done well and in a fair and just way. There was a push at the COP from a group within the Climate Action Network to include the words nature-based solutions in the preambular text of this high-level decision, so that that specific term was in there, indicating that this is how we want this to be done with these safeguards in place. And I think that's a good move. I think in the end, it wasn't a familiar enough term for everyone to sort of jump on board with it, but the intent is there, and I think we need to build that understanding of what that means. The IUCN has sort of adopted that frame for its own work and sort of, socialize that idea. I also want to refer back to a much earlier decision. The 2013 Warsaw decision on REDD+ sets a framework that requires emissions reductions from forests that go through the REDD+ mechanism to apply a set of safeguards. So we already have some precedents for this, at least in the land sector, for how this can be done effectively. One question is, so far that only really applies to developing countries and the way they do their activities, right? Like, why couldn't we think about whether those safeguards should apply to all? I think that's a key question going forward, is and a discussion that we need to have. So I think that would be really great on the land sector side, but maybe it spills over into other sectors as well.
All right, we are quickly running out of time and have way too many great questions to be able to answer them all live. So I want to pick one that ties, or ask a question that ties a few of these strands together, brings it all back to COP26, and is basically a question about whether net zero is enough. Right? So in light of COP26, is net zero enough? Do we need to be talking about net negative emissions? And by whom, for whom? Any quick responses? Janos.
Well, the science is pretty clear that we need to go net negative. And there is a kind of a common understanding we need to go net zero by mid-century and then net negative. But then if we talk about climate justice, we need to think about it quite differently. And maybe some countries need to go net negative much earlier, particularly in the global north, in order to enable a lot of the developing countries to have a somewhat easier transition, longer transition for their decarbonization. And there's very little discussion about that. There's some, but not enough.
Anyone else? Last words? Not in a terrifying
Janos said it perfectly. We have to be aggressively net negative, and we can't lump everyone together. We have there may be some criteria can be developed quickly for which countries have to go net negative and why, and then just move forward with a very strong net negative system.
Right.
At the risk of enlarging this conversation, I think that applies to our emissions reductions commitments. Right now, the US is only promising to do the global average, right? Mm-hmm. That's not a leadership position.
Right.
And I'll just point out, this has been clear since the IPCC's fifth assessment report, which, there were very clear figures that said more or less we need probably 20 gigatons of net negative emissions by the end of the century. We're not doing the things we need to do to achieve that level. So we need to amp that up.
And if I call the international processes constipated, in the US, it's dysfunctional and schizophrenic. So it's a lot worse in the United States.
Angela?
Well, all of this is true. We have to go net negative. We have to get there in the US. We have to go make that commitment and get there sooner. We have to infuse this system with some accountability. There's not nearly enough, and just to underscore Janos's early point, but I really think we can do it. And I think that's what Hunter was saying earlier. It's a political problem. Those are often more intransigent than the technical problems. But I as much as much of a crisis as I know we all know this is, I just think we have to hang on to the fact that we do have the tools to do it, and every point in the right direction, every step in the right direction is essential. And we saw a few at Glasgow.
That's the kind of optimistic note I'd like to end on here. So thank you very much to our distinguished panelists today. Thanks to Jen Brown here at the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy, who organizes and runs these webinars. We will capture all of these questions that we didn't get to answer today and pass them on to panelists to see if we can get some more answers out of them. And those will be posted on the Institute website with the recording of this webinar. And you can find our website at carbonremoval.info. That's carbon removal, all one word, .info. Thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are.
Thank you. Bye-bye.